Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this CBR webinar. So today's webinar is entitled Looking Forwards, Backwards, Archaeological and Geological Perspectives on a Sustainable Future. So our speakers today will explore the roles and responsibilities of geology and archaeology in addressing fundamental aspects of sustainable development. And this will include themes such as water, mineral resources, energy, and disaster risk. I'm Matthew Jones. I'm Professor of Quaternary Science in the School of Geography and Future Food Beacon of Excellence at the University of Nottingham. And I have the pleasure of chairing today's event. With people joining us from all over the world today, and welcome, very welcome to you all. For those of you who may not be familiar with the CBRL, the Council for British Research in the Levant, who are hosting this event, CBRL is an independent UK research charity and membership organisation that exists to conduct, support and promote research in the humanities, social science and related disciplines on and in the Levant. They're part of the British Academy's International Research Institutes, for which they receive a grant to continue operations, but are grateful to members and friends whose donations enable them to support and develop additional research projects. They have a 100-year history in the region and today have an office in London and 2 institutes in the Levant, the Kenyan Institute in East Jerusalem and an institute in Amman, which serve as hubs for CBRL's community of scholars from the UK, the Levant and internationally. In normal times, CBRL organise a regular programme of lectures in the UK and at our institutes, and we're very pleased to be able to bring a new version of these events to you in the form of these webinars. We very much hope you enjoy today's webinar and that you'll be able to join us for future events, either in person, hopefully one day, or online. Do take a look at the CBRL website for more information, and please consider joining their mailing list for monthly updates on other events such as this one, for research activities and more. Before I introduce our speakers today, just a quick note on housekeeping. The webinar will take the form of a keynote presentation from Professor Ian Stewart, followed by shorter responses from Professor Abujaba and Dr. Palmer. As we listen to our speakers, please do post any questions you would like to ask them by using the Q&A function that you should find at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time at the end to answer and discuss these questions after we've listened to our 3 speakers. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce our speakers today. Professor Ian Stewart is the newly appointed El Hassan Research Chair in Sustainability at the Royal Scientific Society in Jordan. He's the former director of the Sustainable Earth Institute at the University of Plymouth in the UK. And Ian's long-standing research interests are in geological hazards, geology for sustainable development, and geoscience communication. His geocommunication work has been built on a 15-year partnership with BBC Television, presenting earth science programmes such as Earth, the Power of the Planet, How Earth Made Us, How to Grow a Planet, The Rise of the Continents, and Planet Oil. Professor Stewart was awarded an MBE for his services to geography and geology education, and currently holds a UNESCO chair in Geoscience and Society, and leads the UNESCO's International Geoscience and Geoports Programme Project 685 on geology and sustainable development. Professor Nizar Abujaba is the director of the Centre for Natural and Cultural Heritage at the German Jordanian University, which he established in 2011. Previously, Professor Nizar worked at Yarmouk University, where he directed the UNESCO Chair for Desert Studies and Desertification Control. And prior to his current role as the Centre Director at the German Jordanian University, was the Dean of Research and Graduate Studies. A geologist by training, Professor Nizar's diverse interests revolve around the use of earth science in resolving pressing issues relating to water resources and management, climate change, sustainable planning and cultural heritage. Most recently, he's led a number of projects aimed at reviving the ancient Nabatean flood control system in Petra, a project that won the ICROM Athal Award for Good Practices in Cultural Heritage Conservation and Management in the Arab region last year. Dr. Carol Palmer is Director of the Council for British Research in the Levant, based in Amman. She's an anthropologist, environmental archaeologist and botanist. She wrote her PhD on traditional farming in northern Jordan and subsequently studied Bedouin from southern Jordan as part of the Wadi Fanan project. Her research interests concentrate on recording rural life in its many forms, the contemporary and recent use of plants on the broadest level, cultivated, gathered and grazed, and the effects of changes in food production practices on the landscape and in society. She's also currently an honorary fellow at Bournemouth University. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Iain Stewart for our main presentation today.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks a lot. I think this probably officially counts as my first talk in Amman, even though I'm in Plymouth, still in the UK, waiting to come out to Amman. So I'll claim it as a half talk. It's an absolute delight to be here. Let me just share my screen and we can kick off. So hopefully someone can tell me. You should be seeing the full screen there. Someone confirm that you're seeing it before I go off. And yeah. So I'm so it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm a geologist by background. And so for us, for geologists, we have this adage that the present is the key to the past. But actually what we're all going to be talking about really today is this big question about to what extent is the past the key to the future, and that's within the context of the current emphasis on many of the societal grand challenges, but in particular around sustainable development agenda, which is something that I'm increasingly interested in and working towards. So as a geologist, my past is 4.5 billion years old, 4,567 million years old. So that's a heck of a past to bring to attempt to look at the future with. To put it into context, this Mayan Pyramid you're going to see a little bit more in a minute of is around about 45 meters high, which means that every meter is 100 million years, which means that every centimeter there is 1 million years. The modern humans really want about, 2 millimeters on that pyramid, and the full length of human civilization in terms of cities and agriculture, etc., is probably the width of a human hair lying at the bottom of that pyramid. And yet that, of course, is the context within which we operate. It's our human world, it's our human history, and it's the context of the continuity of that that really is what we're talking about today. As a geologist, even at the start of geology, when geology emerged as a discipline in the late 18th century with the work of James Hutton in Theory of the Earth, it was very clear that geoscience was about the furtherment of human progress. This is the second, in the first page, the second paragraph of his Theory of the Earth. This globe of the Earth is a habitable world, and on its fitness for this purpose, our sense of wisdom and its formation must depend. So our understanding of that physical world, the mission of that is for sustainable human progress. And I'm going to argue that we've deviated from that significantly and to our cost, and that we really have to grasp again this knowledge of what science and technology and knowledge is for in order to address many of the huge issues that we're facing. So that question, that really the issue is around the survival of human species, but also of the kind of complex societies, advanced society that we've developed, is the key to this issue of sustainability. And by sustainability, I'm using a definition you see here of long-term well-being for all within the natural limits of nature. And to illustrate that, you've got the idea of these planetary boundaries from Rockstrom and the group, which kind of highlight the main biogeophysical threats to humanity really in different areas, and kind of gauge them such that things around the applications of phosphorus and nitrogen, and also in biosphere, so biodiversity loss, are critical. But other aspects like greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, freshwater, etc., are areas that are moving into the risky areas. And so this is a moment in time where I think everyone is very concerned about the potential climatic and ecological crisis that we're facing. But this notion that we're facing an environmental crisis isn't new. This is a long quote from Tertullian in the 2nd century AD, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is a litany of lament about the nature of the world, the pleasant land of the past being obliterated, turning things into dreary and dangerous wastes. Cultivated fields have subdued forests, flocks and herds have expelled wild beasts, sandy deserts are now sown. And then if you go down to the end, I've bolded the last one now, our numbers are burdensome to the world, which can hardly supply us from its natural elements. Our wants grow more and more keen, and our complaints more bitter in all mouths, whilst nature fails in affording us her usual sustenance. So this is clearly in a Roman Empire where people are already seeing this idea of too many people with too few resources, and the kind of environmental calamity that is coming. What we do know from history, the lessons of historians, is that history is littered with societies that have come and gone. And I decided I was going to stay away, deliberately so, from the Levant Near East area, where everyone probably on this call is an expert except for me. I thought I'd show something where we filmed this in a series called How Earth Made Us about 10 years ago. And this is Chaco Canyon in the Four Corners area of Southwest USA. And so what we have here is a dispersed society that was very successful today in terms of agriculture in that Four Corners area. Existed for about 1,000 years in different guises, really, all the way up to the latter part of the 13th century, where it went into really rapid terminal decline. And here at Miso Verde as well, which is close by, what we see is the physical and cultural manifestations of a collapsing society, that where the city starts to build its own fortifications, which was a defense against the kind of societal turmoil and upheaval that had been created. And even evidence, for example, of famine and even cannibalism in the very last death throes, really, of this society. This chap here was our guard during filming, and his main job was to make sure I didn't say the word abandonment and cannibalism, both of which are very culturally difficult in this part of the world, even though it's been written up in very esteemed academic journals. But this is a very sensitive issue about what happens when societies get confronted by a scale of natural change that is difficult to get past. It's overwhelming. And the reason why I say natural is because it's now pretty much shown by a number of paleoenvironmental high resolution records and modeling work that the death throes, the death knell rather, of the ancient American Pueblans, ancient Pueblan people, was a mega drought around about 1276, a multi-decadal mega drought in 1276 to 1297, which affected that whole region. And it's a region then that bounces back and forth between relatively pluvial wet phases and times of great aridity and dryness. And what's interesting is the great shift across from the east coast of North America to the west under this manifest destiny of that was our land that we could just take, was done in the middle really part of the 19th century, when the conditions in that area, for various reasons, were much wetter than before. So this notion that the West was this garden, empty garden, just waiting to take this the people from the East Coast, was quickly pushed back by the time it just 10, 20 years later in the 1870s onwards, when drought started to bite back into that area. And this is because this area is actually affected by an oceanographic meteorological condition called La Nina and El Nino that operates in the Pacific Ocean. But actually the weather fronts that sweep in from that are really quite crippling. And so what we see here is the result of death, the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, just showing that this thing goes into the 20th century. But this is probably one of the most extraordinary graphs I think I've seen, and I've not used it for a while, so it's nice to revisit it. This is a record of the flow rate of the Colorado River as determined from dendrochronological records and nearby, and just with the last section in bold is the actually observed records. And what you can see is that this region of the Southwest USA just lurches between aridity and wetter, more benign conditions. You see in the big star is that mega drought period that finished off the ancient Puebloan people. But you can see that it's part of a very staccato climate response system all the way through, going through up until the 19th century. Now, the European, the East Coasters, if you like, arrived in that part, the latter part of the 19th century. And between 1900 and 1906, the flow rate of the Colorado River was measured. And it was measured in order to determine whether or not there was enough water in this area for big scale civilization or big scale development of cities, etc. And on the basis of that, they then designed the Hoover Dam, which blocked off Lake Mead to give us that water. And what you can see there is that by an unfortunate accident, the 6-year period that they measured the Colorado River happened to be the largest flow rate in the last 1,000 years. So it was an extraordinary time to decide how much water this particular area. I suspect if they'd had that graph in front of them, they would not have built the Hoover Dam, and there wouldn't be such huge development in that area. But they did build a dam, and the dam had two purposes. It was to provide water to this region, and it's to provide electricity for, again, the region as well. So water to nearby cities, and electricity generation in order to that whole area to develop. And as we look ahead, really, with climate change, you can see again, this is a simplified version of that graph showing the mega drought back in 1290s, and then the blue dot for when the Hoover Dam was conceived and designed. What we see is those fluctuations are going to be accentuated by climate change. All the models, all the climate models, although they disagree for some parts of the world, for Southwest USA, they're pretty consistent. They see a gradual descent into more and more aridity as we go into the future. And that quote from Richard Seeger there, in the Southwest, the levels of aridity seen in 1950s multi-year drought or the 1930s Dust Bowl become the new climatology by mid-century, a perpetual drought. And the importance there is that just a few miles away, tens of miles away, we have this, one of the great cities of the modern world. This is Las Vegas, a city that is dependent on the electricity from the Hoover Dam, a city that is dependent largely for its water from Lake Mead, a city that has been built in the middle of the desert because we could, because human ingenuity and technology in the 20th century made it possible for us to do something as extraordinary as this. And it seems incredible to think that this city may not survive into the middle of this century. But on the other hand, when you look at those climate records, it seems extraordinary that it could possibly survive into the middle of this century. Water will be the crippling, limiting element of this and other cities in this particular area. When I was filming in here, I was astounded to see that there's lots of the streets. You see a lot of greenery here, and actually some of the streets that we filmed in had tree-lined avenues, and there were sprinkler systems, and the sprinklers were using fresh water. When I asked why on earth is it using fresh water, they said, well, it's in case small children drink the water and get diseases, and so we use fresh water. So we can see that the relationship of this city to water is absolutely quite perverse. So really, this brings me to my second part of the talk, really, which is that we have left behind an extraordinary stable period. I mean, when I did my degree, nothing happened in the Holocene, and then we started to find out that actually there was quite a lot of things happening. But in broad terms, the climate was stable enough that agriculture and cities could take off in relatively stable conditions. And yet we are living right now in the last, our generation, the generation before us are living at a moment in time, not just in human history, I think in Earth history, where we're switching into this idea where humans now are a key driving force of most of our environments. So the idea of the Anthropocene is now kind of taking over. And when we think of the Anthropocene, cultural theorists get rather upset because they say, well, actually, this isn't really the Anthropocene. It's a very small part. It's a part of the human condition that's driven by capitalism, by free market capitalism, by a rampant economic growth that is driven by profit maximization, and the manifest as really high levels of consumptions and globalization. And that, of course, is true. That is the nature of not just Las Vegas, but our modern world. But it's worthwhile thinking about that idea of free market capitalism and economic growth as to why it came about. It came around out of the early part of the 20th century, where whether it was political figures like Hitler or the kind of raw economic barons like your Rockefellers and your Carnegies, there were individuals who held huge wealth or huge power in individual hands. And so the notion of the free market became this idea of disseminating, of spreading, making sure that the wealth from business, business was seen as the way to provide well-being to societies. So by generating income that could be then spread through business, and businesses then were required to distribute it to their shareholders in order to help get that wealth out into society rather than being held off. The other aspect I think that's important in terms of the free market economics and the mental models really of the Anthropocene is the notion that humans were self-interested rational beings. That actually you don't try and change the market. The market dominated because we as individuals, as long as we had the right information, we would make choices that adjusted to our well-being. And that itself would shape the market. So the market would be reflected by human choice and everything would be okay. We now know from psychologists and from a whole bunch of other ways that actually humans aren't self-interested rational beings. We operate often with our own irrationalities and lots of other things influence. However, it has to be said, and the point will be made if I don't, is that economic growth has brought great riches for the world and great development. This is Hans Rosling, who's one of the leaders in that, his book Factfulness, amazing outline really of just how economic growth has permeated through and has raised not just incomes in parts of the world as we've seen here, but also it's absolutely reduced infant mortality, deaths. Almost all the indices we see have improved as a result of this permeation of income through this free market capitalism, but at a cost. This is the great acceleration, as anthropologists refer to it. On the left, we have human indices, and on the right, we have physical indices. And each of these charts is from 1750 all the way through to the present day, and you'll see a dashed line, which is 1950. So that's the period of the Industrial Revolution as it is in the Western world. And what we see is that really nothing happens until the 20th century, and particularly until 1950 in the post-war economic boom. And then the human planet explodes around the world. And then you can see on the right-hand side the impact that has on the natural planet. Almost all the natural systems react, whether it's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or methane, or stratosphere, or whether it's ocean acidification, or things to do with fishing, etc. The natural world reacts to this several order of magnitude scale of imposition by humanity on it. And so what we're ending up with then is that economic growth has been at the cost of the planet in terms of driving a climatic and an ecological crisis that is starting to become ever more apparent. There's lots of diagrams I could show for this, but this is one where we see that idea of history in different time slices. So in the far left, we see tens of millions of years, then millions of years, then hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and then more recent history. And what we see then is that as we look forward 1950 to 2150, we see the change in trajectory of temperature rising up, going up to, well, by 2100 and 2200, maybe between 5 and 10 degrees, which if you then sweep across to your left, brings you to a temperature conditions that the planet has not seen for 20 or 30 or 40 million years. And certainly humanity has never seen that. So we have taken the biophysics of the planet and changed it outside the realm of the limits within which civilization, everything that we know, developed, which is that yellow line that you'll see there from the Holocene. And so this is an extraordinary change. So that was the situation we are now. What about the future? Well, 2015, I think, will be the year that people will remember as the year when things changed. 2015 was the year that the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk comes in, which is something that's a lot in my world of disaster risk. It was the 2015 was Paris Climate Agreement, where we had trajectory, a roadmap essentially of how we're going to deal with climate change. And then, of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Each of these set out a framework, but more than a framework, a roadmap of how the world needed to deal with these absolutely major challenges that it had to itself. So my question is really that I spend a lot of my time thinking about it. So how does the academic world, the university world, the scientific world for me, how do we change? Because we can't go on with business as usual. There has to be a change here. How will it change happen? So one of the things is we know that the planet's interconnected. We know that there's different spheres, the hydrosphere and the geosphere, the biosphere, the cryosphere of ice, the atmosphere. They're all interconnected. You change one, you change the rest of it, whether you call it Gaia or Earth system science. But in the same way, what we haven't seen is we haven't seen that switch in the academic sector. And it has to happen. We need to start working. These are wicked, in other words, almost unsolvable problems in terms of simple solutions. They're going to require interdisciplinary at very least, and perhaps transdisciplinary when everyone's really involved and really focused on a problem inquiry. And so in terms of science communication, which is my area, this graph just, or this plot just shows how what we really need to be doing is to be taking the environmental sciences, which was given as the technical data and our data models, and really blurring that and blending it with the creative arts and the media arts, which provides those ideas of inspiration and motivation and different ways of connecting to different groups and audiences, alongside the social sciences, the human sciences that allow us to develop how we frame our problem, the mental models by which people understand them, and the communication channels that we reach them through. And then finally, but not least, is the deeper notions of ethics, values, worldwide views that will come from philosophy and religion. And those need to be blended and brought together if we're going to make any inroads in trying to address the rest of these issues. That's already starting to happen in terms of the approach that scientists are taking to society. So this, the graph on the left-hand side really is different ways of modes of science, really depending on the motivation of the researcher, which is the vertical axis, whether it's pursuit of knowledge or applied problem solving, or on the horizontal axis, the participation of other users, the public or other stakeholders. And what you'll see is that mode one science down the bottom left is your traditional academic. It's publishing research papers, going to conferences. It's us trying to think of what research we're interested in and then basically trying to communicate that. And then there's user-inspired basic research where we tweak our research because we think it fits with what other people are interested in. Then there's pure applied, which is really working to other people's problems. But if you shift to the right-hand side, you get into areas that are coming through and referred to as post-normal, which is co-production, so working alongside your stakeholders and bringing them into the process, and social learning, which is undertaking action research in those very communities themselves. So the nature of science is slowly changing, but I would say it's changing underneath the radar, really. In terms of communication, the way that I interpret that is a three-stage thing of communication. The academic realm is a make and sell, where we use communication just to sell how amazingly clever we are and how fantastic our science is to a public who actually haven't asked for that science. We've just delivered it to them. The sense and respond is communications that recognize that social sciences can really, in psychology, and can really help us understand how people think, how people make decisions, and we can target our messaging more effectively in that realm. But really, the end game for communications is this guide and co-create. The notion that we have guidance, we have academic leadership, we need to show that, but that we need to co-create those alliances and relations with the stakeholders as we move forward, which means that key communication skills for the 21st century will be interdisciplinary working, participatory, bringing other voices in, and being truly reflexive about the work we do. So in relation to that, then, I bring you back to sustainability, and I show you Daly's triangle, which is this notion of, at the bottom, we have everything's based on the ultimate means. We might refer to it as natural capital, which is the biosphere, earth materials, etc. And on the basis of that, we build our industry, we build our cities, our infrastructure, we build our industries, human capital. And on the basis of that, then we have our modern world. But right at the top, we have the ultimate ends, what it's all about: happiness, harmony, fulfillment, well-being, etc. Now, I would argue that the middle part of that graph is the area that we've concentrated on with economic growth and free market economics, with the assumption that it will trickle up basically into well-being. But that's the area of the circular economy and all the rest of it. Most of the people who look at sustainability from a natural side are interested in the ultimate means, making sure the biosphere is protected, making sure earth materials are protected, etc. But really, one of the main purposes of everything else is of human well-being, of people having the ability to have the kind of world that they would like to have. And so, to be honest, the whole thing needs to be all tied together. And what ties it together is a sense of purpose. Purpose being the pursuit of a long-term motivating goal for an individual, for an organization, for a kind of community. And so that's the essence of that I'd like to come back to, about how are we going to develop a purpose-led mission around sustainability that addresses the issue of natural capital in relation to the economic system we have, but is really thinking long-term about human well-being and increasing human well-being. So I'll finish there. My point is that I think we're at a point of transformation. We're at another of these turning points in Earth history, and really what we do over the next 10 years, probably 15 years, will be absolutely critical on looking at the trajectory of that graph that I showed you, going out to 2100 and 2200. And it's how we address those issues here and now with a just transition, looking at human well-being and addressing those natural issues. And I think that this is the place where that long cultural record, that historical record of how past peoples have confronted these types of challenges and got through them or not, will be absolutely critical narrative for us to bring out. And so on that point, I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ian. Lots of food for thought there. I think as we transition into our next speaker, I'd just like to remind everyone that please do as you're thinking about these things, put questions into the Q&A function, which should hopefully you'll be able to find it at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll pick up those questions and be able to discuss them after we've heard from our other two speakers. So now move on to our second speaker of the webinar. So I'd like to invite Professor Nizar Abujaba to share his slides and to respond in some way to what Ian said, but also to tell us about his own work. Thank you, Nizar.
Thank you very much. I think I can't compete with the visual feast that Ian was able to share with us. Clearly, all of these issues that Ian raises are global issues, and maybe it's time to kind of think about Jordan, just because that's what I have in mind for sharing with you. And the idea here is to look forward, backwards at a more local scale. And I'll talk a little bit about Jordan, where we are. I think many of you are familiar with the theory of plate tectonics. And plate tectonics is essentially the idea that the Earth's crust is in continuous motion. And this motion affects the surface nature of the Earth in different areas in different ways. In our case in Jordan, we're situated essentially adjacent to what's called the Dead Sea Rift Valley. And rifting is quite an interesting process. You might take a look at the graph on your right side of the screen here. And one of the things you might notice is how we conceptualize how rifting happens, which is that you have some sort of plume that forms a linear type of feature, and this plume uplifts the area that's going to be rifted, and then you have a series of parallel down faulted basins that fall, but you can see that uplifting is also part of the rifting process. And so when we look at Jordan, we, as I said, we're adjacent to this so-called Dead Sea Rift, which was initiated about 30 million years ago. And I like to show images like this through Google Earth. And so, of course, Jordan is at the top part of your screen. And you might wonder what's the idea here. And obviously you can see the Rift Valley. So this is kind of a very clear delineation that can everybody in Jordan knows about. But also it's important to conceptualize the idea of what it was like to live in this area based on this this topography that we have here. First of all, it's notable that we do have uplifting along both sides of the rift, just like our cartoon that I showed in the previous slide kind of shows. And so you have these highlands that are adjacent to this rift valley. And these highlands basically are separated by this deep depression. So what you have, of course, here is the Dead Sea, which is about 400 meters below sea level. And then you have the adjacent highlands, which are at elevations that, of course, fluctuate. But in Amman, you're talking about a little more than 1,000 meters above sea level. In Petra in the south, you're talking about 1,600 meters, and all along this rift valley, you're essentially always a little bit plus or minus near 1,000. And then when you go towards the east, you start to drop. So the Azraq Basin over here, you're about at 550 meters. So you can kind of visualize that. And you might say, okay, so what makes this interesting? And so you might think about what's going on here in terms of people living on this land. And so living on this land means that you have this high ridge that's on this western margin of the Rift Valley. And this high areas where you get most of the rain, because you have this orographic effect, and this is Amman here. And so most of your rainfall is along this area, this highland area here, and in the south as well. Sorry, here. So you get most of the rain here, and you might think, where would people want to live? And it turns out that what you have in terms of water resources is basically concentrated along this very narrow margin. And the reason for that is because these highlands are mostly made up of Cretaceous limestone, and these limestones are very good aquifers. So what happens is you get the rainfall in these highlands, and then you have the water percolating into the aquifers, and then they come out along the outcrops along this ridge. So you find all of the old cities are basically constrained to this area, first of all, because of the rainfall, and secondly, because of the springs. So you have that. You also have the issue of these traversing drainage basins that are cutting into the rift, because of course you start to develop rivers that kind of flow into the Rift Valley. And these rivers are also areas where people tend to concentrate, again, because of the springs and because they basically represent pathways that allow travel from this area to the Mediterranean Sea. And so you have this, plus you have that differentiation in terms of climate. So this area down here is dry and hot, and up here is cold. So you have a lot of tribes actually having annual migrations up and down the Rift Valley, winter in the warm areas and the summer in the cooler areas. So you have the whole area is set up in a way that is very much concentrated along this Rift Valley. Also, what you might want to keep in mind is that this Rift Valley is very steep. And so you can kind of see it here. You can see very well that this margin is fault controlled, and the cliffs are very steep. And so you might imagine the challenges that come from wanting to build towns, roads, water distribution infrastructure, and all of those things along this unstable, seismically active zone. And so when we think about the idea that Jordan has been almost permanently inhabited throughout the Holocene, it definitely needs to cross your mind that people might have learned a couple of things along the way. And so people actually did learn how to manage this very challenging landscape, not to add the fact that you also had climatic fluctuations throughout that time. So that's another dimension to it. So this is a very difficult place to live. And so if you want to think about how people manage to traverse these types of challenges, I don't think you can find a better place to look than here. So this is Wadi Musa. This is to the south, again, our Wadi Araba, which is the southern part of the Jordan Rift Valley, and Petra. And you can see, again, you're along this very steep incline. So you have the Shara Mountains here, so you're 1,600 meters above sea level over here. Wadi Musa about 1,200, then Petra itself, so you're about 1,000 plus or minus, and then down to about minus 300 meters when you get to Wadi Araba. So this is a very steep area. So people, the Nabateans about 2,000 years ago decided that this is a perfect place to build their fantastic city of Petra. And of course, they had to overcome a lot of challenges. One of them is the area is pretty dry. Secondly, it's pretty steep. Thirdly, the plant cover isn't very strong. And so you might think, okay, maybe they weren't so smart trying to choose this place, but obviously they had their reasons, so they did. And they had to, let's say, manage a lot of issues related to water resources, and also because of the steepness and the way that rainfall patterns are there, that they had to deal also with flooding. So you have problems of water, you have problems of agriculture, you have problems of flooding, and also they were merchants. And so one of the most important aspects of what they were doing was maintaining infrastructure for roads. Because obviously it was a caravan stop, and they made most of their fortunes through trade, and so they had their pathways down to Wadi Araba, down to the Mediterranean Sea, and so they couldn't afford their roads to be washed away and to be cut off. So they had to deal a lot with a lot of maintaining of infrastructure, in addition to all of the other challenges I mentioned earlier. So so what I'm going to focus on a little bit is the idea of flash flooding. And so again, this is a different type of perspective. This is Wadi Musa and Petra. And these arrows show all of the areas around Petra where we found terraces that were designed to control runoff. The idea was that you can't control flooding through one set of infrastructure, because it's a dispersed drainage basin, and you didn't know where the stream might come from. And so essentially they had a non-centralized flood control system that attempted to stop the rain wherever it might have manifested. So one of the site actually we're interested in is Wadi Hrimiya. Wadi Hrimiya actually is a stream that flows into the Treasury Plaza right beyond the Siq. And so many times when we see those videos of flooding in Petra, actually the water comes from this small tributary that actually we found was heavily intervened with in order to try to mitigate the problem of flooding that would come from that site. So we've developed this drainage system map and try to delineate exactly where the water would come from, which areas. And so this is another type of map. This one actually is interesting because it emphasizes the steepness of the area. So the area is very steep. It's a small drainage basin. It's about 0.3 kilometers, but it brings in a lot of water, and it does pose a hazard to the people who are down in the sea. So we did a scanning of the area. This is our colleague, Dr. Abdullah. And we've actually delineated the areas, has over 100 of these terraces all along them. And the whole idea of these terraces, again, was to try to mitigate the problem of flooding, not from a centralized set of dams, but of a dispersed group of dams. So we have these very relatively small terraces and check dam systems that are designed to inhibit the movement of water. So we actually did a serious full documentation of this area using a 3D scanner in addition to the drones. And then we did a lot of work, actually. I can't go into everything. We did a lot of work on the hydrology and trying to understand how much water is going through and the depth of the rainfall, and how much water we would expect from every specific event, and what's the rain runoff coefficient. And so we did, and plus we developed a system for collecting runoff data, so we could actually measure runoff, and we distributed different runoff sensors through the area. We distributed also a bunch of rainfall measurement devices as well. So we have a lot of rain and runoff data. We've done computer modeling on the hydrology of the area. And based on all of these things, plus talking with the local community and talking with the archaeologists who are also with us on the team, like Katrina, all of us said, okay, we have to do this in a way that's, let's say, will help mitigate the flooding problem, but also in a way that's respectful of the nature of the site. Petra is a World Heritage Site, as all of you know. And so based on lots of discussions, lots of science, lots of stakeholder meetings, and lots of training of the local people, we decided, okay, let's go ahead. And so we started working on rebuilding this terrace system, of course, with the help of our architect here, Safa, and the local communities who helped us rebuild check dams like this one. And yeah, so, and now we're expanding this project, and we're also keeping an eye on to see exactly how good the Nabateans actually were, and see how well this system would work. And so the idea again is looking forward backward. Can we actually look forward in terms of solving problems like flooding in Petra, which is till this day a hazard that the local authorities need to deal with. And so the idea, of course, is I think we can learn a lot of ideas regarding sustainability and green technologies, learning from how people used to do this in the past. So that's what I wanted to say.
Many thanks, Nizar. It's really great to hear about your work. So thanks for sharing it with us. So now we're going to move on to our third speaker. Carol. Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, thanks. Please do carry on.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Ian and Nizar, for some very thought-provoking talks today. I'm here in a sense to speak about my experience working, if you like, with traditional management of the land. People who know me know that I've worked on fellahin, or peasants, and traditional agriculture make sure I'm sharing. In northern Jordan, can everyone see that? Picking up on the theme of using some of the Google satellite imagery. So I've principally done research in northern Jordan among fellahin in the Horan area, and also in southern Jordan around Wadi Finan and Shobak, and around the Tafila area. And I wanted to share with you today some reflections on what being with those people. Most of this work, I have to say, was done 20 to 30 years ago, even, looking at their orientation towards the land, people who are close to the land. Obviously, Jordan has changed tremendously. in the last 50, 60 years. And I went out particularly to search for people who could help me understand, especially agriculture, wheat agriculture. This is the place where wheat and barley and many of the annual crops some 10,000 years ago were domesticated. Farming has been here for a long time. Also pastoralism, the whole of the Holocene, there's been a relationship of people managing their environment with crops and animals. So I just want to show you some of the people that I met and who helped me along the way. These are people from northern Jordan. Those who know some of the clothing will recognize the typical dress of the Horan. It's along the rift, along the highlands, quite a well-watered area that Nizar was describing. A real focus in the Horan on wheat and agriculture and ploughing and getting the most from the land. In the south of Jordan, I was mainly dealing with Bedouin, but also villagers who were using the Rift Valley, the geography, to go from better watered highlands down to the Wadi Araba and around Fainan. These photos are from some time ago, and I feel very privileged to have seen some of these practices, which I know are less common these days. So along that rift, we have thresholds for cultivation of wheat and barley and the main crops. Wheat, you can cultivate with an average rainfall between 250 and 300 millimeters. Barley, around 200 to 250, and lentil around 300. And these are some of the most common crops that are still grown, obviously, to this day. And this is the region from where they come. This is at the heart of the so-called fertile Crescent. What I wanted to show is that averages in this region mask a high degree of variability year to year. And although averages may say 250 or 300 millimeters, in fact, as you can see from this chart that was done as part of my PhD work and published later in 1998, there's a very close match between how much rainfall you get and yield. But also, if you can pick it out, if you go below that 250 rainfall, average rainfall, the yield actually crashes. You get failure, crop failure. And much about what traditional agriculture, the life of the Fellahin was about ensuring you got a crop, so-called risk minimization, as opposed to a more modern way of looking at the land in terms of maximizing production. So traditional ways of managing water in conservation involve ploughing. Richard Antoun, a very famous anthropologist who worked in Kufr al-Ma in the north of Jordan, recorded this phrase, "He who has tilled his soil twice has watered it once." And you can still, these pictures are from some time ago, but you can still see people to this day in some of the rockier, more inaccessible areas still using the traditional ard, which just turns the top part of the soil to plow the land. This is to receive the crop, but also to keep the moisture within the soil for the wheat later. weeding is also a part of that moisture conservation. We're really up very far in the north of Jordan here, remembering a day I spent weeding with some of the fellahin there. It's not only you're removing the weeds that are competing with the crop for water and light, but also you can eat and consume those weeds or give them to your animals. The principles of fallow, this ploughing, is that you're trying to break the connection between the surface of the land with the stored moisture below from the ploughing. So by ploughing, you're creating air pockets that prevent water escaping. And even if you conserve only 10% of the water that was received in the winter, you can ensure that you have a crop the next year. Also, when people are close to the land, the fellahin, there was much discussion about the timing of the crop, when you sowed, how much you sowed. Early rainfall usually indicates a good year and you want to get out and sow as soon as you possibly can. Again, sowing rates vary according to the rainfall and the land quality. And fallow, this off year, people traditionally use either a 2 or a 3 year regime where they have fallow as part of it. The fallow being when you're ploughing to conserve water, but also during that fallow year, you can plant so-called summer crops that use a relatively minimal amount of water, but still give you a crop. In order to ensure supply, people diversified. These are some summer crops again from different areas. Wheat, barley, lentil are from this area, from the Fertile Crescent, but we have crops coming in from here, from all around the globe through time. The lubia, cow or Asiatic bean, is actually from the old world, although you have the new world beans coming in later. And then a very ancient crop known actually in Mesopotamia, also in ancient Egypt, the mello type of melon, also known as fagus locally because it snaps, very much like cucumber. And then, of course, people had livestock as well, and livestock were integrated or are integrated with cultivation. They eat the straw. People grow wheat and barley not only for the grains that humans eat, but also for the straw as well, which is absolutely essential to maintain the crops, with the herd becoming like a walking larder. And here are some pictures, some historic and some that I took along the Kerak Plateau and in Tafila in Jordan. And just, I'm showing here a picture of the Dana Reserve, Rumana Hill in the background, the Wadi Dana, and the very famous Dana village. These people lived somewhere between agriculture and pastoralism, going out in summer to these rugged mountains and coming back to their village in winter as well, mixing the different ways of life in order to live. But this is a comparison of this very rugged terrain, which in some ways, and it's certainly at some times of year, we're in springtime now, so it looks particularly green, can look very unpromising, but people lived and were very close to the land through the whole course of the Holocene. And also what the village of Dana has is some irrigated orchards as well, with olives, figs, pomegranates, and to say that many of the valleys had these spring-fed orchards too, and that they were communally managed with people sharing the water through allotted time periods to grow their trees. And also in summer, in spring, people would often go out to these mountains, but in summer, people would move to the orchards to collect the crops too. I also wanted to share that in this region, the Bedouin also cultivated too. And this is a picture from, I had the privilege of working with Ken Russell and below Petra at a Bedouin site, a Badul camping site called Torum Dai in the Wadi Siag. And the Bedouin there, they were reusing at that time some of the Nabatean areas for cultivation. At this time, they were using it for tobacco, in fact. But this is Saad, one of the Bedouin that I met with Ken Russell, who had his field where he was directing the rainfall that comes in very heavily at times towards his field. So you can see that he has a channel here, and then he has plowed such that he can spread out the water so he can grow his crop. The traditional way also to manage water and manage your crops is also through storage. So very well known in the region, you have these areas of springs, but people had cisterns, beer, where they collected water. This is an example from northern Jordan, and people do this still to this day. And there are many, development schemes now looking at refurbishing these systems. You store water, you store food through your animals, but also through the storage of milk products. And also in traditional housing, grain bins, either this one made of mud, which is freestanding, or actually within the architecture of the house, was the dominant feature of housing in the past. And also people would bury and store underground as well. So in thinking about how people in the past and still to this day manage to get a crop and live a life, and have done so for many thousands of years from this landscape, I wanted to reflect on the ways and the small scale ways that people use the land through moisture conservation, through ploughing, weeding, opportunism and how they crop, being very close to the land, diversification, mobility, going out with their animals, ranging, irrigation, which could often be spring-fed and small-scale, terracing, which Professor Nizar has spoken about, and also through storage. Much of what I have done has been to record and really learn, but in thinking about sustainability, we realize that much has changed. The life has changed. People living this life way are very few. But how can we use this knowledge actually gathered over thousands of years, which has its own science, which has its own knowledge of the land? How can we use it in making an area that is known for the origins of farming, the origins of agriculture, but is now one of the most food insecure places in the world? How can we bring this back? And I'm saying this knowing that there are now movements within Jordan and also Palestine to respect again and to look again at these ways of life and this traditional knowledge and how we can use it going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So we'll just come to some questions now, and if I can ask all the speakers to show themselves again, and we can join back together for some discussion. So I'm just going to pick up some of the questions that have come in through the chat as you've all been speaking, and I'm going to in no particular order. And thank you for everyone for sending these in. I'm going to start with a question from Bob Bewley, who asks about sort of a broad approach to, if we want to save the human species as a way of saving the planet, where is the most important place to start that process? Maybe not just place, but in terms of.
Yeah, I suppose I asked for that by given the context of my talk, really. Is that for me, Matt, or you've hung?
Geography and educationally, you know, where do we? Yes, if you could start, Ian, please. And then,
you were just dipping out there, Matt. Yeah, I'm saying I brought that on myself by the provocation, really. I mean, it's clearly a colossal scale of problem, and it's not the only one. We've got a set of nested, interconnected, so-called wicked problems in the sense of them not having a simple solution, and that's why we need these different approaches. So, you know, I think the question of where do we start is difficult. You know, it's obviously a difficult one. There's different levels that we can approach that. And, you know, action has to take at all different levels. It has to happen at government level and business level. It has to happen at individual level, and then in between. And in between, the bit that I guess we have control over, we have influence on, is the academic world. You know, what is our? I think one of the things we have to really think about is what are, as academics, as experts, what is our role and responsibility in this? And it, you know, increasingly surprises me that people who really understand the science and understand the nature of particularly the climate record and ecological record, and can see what's happening, we still find ourselves impaired and constrained about taking action. We still hide amongst writing academic papers and going to conferences and presenting it, and not feeling that we should be catalysts for action in society, or even activists out there. And that's a really difficult, you know, ethical, moral territory to do. But I think until, you know, if the experts and the academics who understand the science aren't going to take action, then why the hell should anyone else? You know, I mean, this is one of the ironies of the whole thing. And I think it really questions the whole academic exercise, really, because the assumption we've always had is that if we just have more knowledge about these things and put that knowledge out, then because people are self-interested, rational beings, it'll take care of itself. It's kind of that free market economics, but from knowledge production. And what we're realizing now is, one, we don't have time, and two, that doesn't seem to work. And so I think we need a new model, a new way of thinking. And I think universities in general need to start having that discussion internally, and academics need to have it. So, I mean, that's one tiny slice of the problem, and I appreciate it doesn't address the question at all, but it's the only bit that I can get my head around to thinking of, because the problem is so huge.
Okay, so we have a question that maybe follows on from that. I'll ask Ian to answer first, but then I'd also like to ask Nizar and Carol for their thoughts on this one. So this is a question coming from Hussam Hussain, who asks, you know, given that all those things you've just said, I guess, how do you plan to ensure sort of science policy engagement in your new role, with a particular view of sustainable development in Jordan?
I think it's about being a bridge from the expertise, the scientific and technical expertise that we have, to the people that matter. And that could be communities, or it could be government officials, or it could be anything in between. I think that the issue is that for too long we've been held up, and we've held up ourselves as experts with this, again, the assumption that we just need to say this is how it is. And if we can get our communications clear enough, everyone will see it that way. We now realize that we're just one voice in this broader spectrum of voices and stakeholders. So I think scientists need to get out and start engaging with the people who are really going to be affected by these things. And I think that means, more, as I said, more interdisciplinary, more participatory. So the kind of projects that I'd really like to work on with the Royal Scientific Society are projects where we're getting the academics out of their comfort zone, really, and into, might be literally the community, or it might be into understanding how the media works, how policy works, how you actually affect real change out there, not in the academic world. Because in my view, we have enough information, we have enough data. Of course, it's nice to have some more, but we shouldn't wait for that data in order to take action. So I think it's about understanding the communication channels a lot better. And I think once we do that, then I think academics, again, and experts can really start to make a contribution.
Nizar, do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah, please.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think there's always this issue of linking what we know with the actual practice, and I think we're always stuck with this issue of, okay, we know everything and we are screaming at the top of our lungs and nobody's listening. And I think the only way to actually get things done is to go and do it yourself. And so this is kind of the attitude I have with this project in Petra, is that, okay, we know how these things worked, we've mapped them, we've documented them. And if we don't go out there and rebuild them ourselves and show people that they work, that, okay, this is interesting, but nobody's going to take it very seriously. So I think this going this extra step of actually implementing some of these ideas and proving that they work will probably be very useful in that regard.
Carol, I don't know if you want to come in on this one.
Yes, it's very much what we're all grappling with right now. We've created, or we've learnt from others, this amazing knowledge as researchers, as scientists, and I guess both particularly for me, who feels that I've particularly benefited from the knowledge of people here. How do you, how do you then articulate it while still recognizing that things are very much changed? A lot of the traditional agriculture and systems were when the population was hugely lower, and also I've often said it's the traditional agricultural life, and many of these things are hugely hard work, the harvest and carrying water and all of these things. So how can we find some sort of modification or way around it and contribute to the debate? I've seen in my time in Jordan a shift, I would say, in that when I was first living with families in villages, they were saying, "Why are you interested in this old stuff?" and I had a particular connection, if you like, with the grandparents, and who used to sort of find it charming that I wanted to know the names of the weeds and how they did things, to now actually a generation that is really engaged in this, and there's more interest. I mean, it's slow food, all of these kinds of movements. So it's how to, I guess, just share. A lot of the knowledge I have is already published, is how to communicate that. And yes, to say it is for generations who are here now, but how can we those of us, including CBRL, as an organization, engage and be involved in this phrase that's now very common, knowledge exchange as well.
Thanks, Carol. Lots of questions coming in now, so I just want to check with the panelists that they're happy to keep going, given we're now at the end of our official time. But I'm going to, if that's okay, I will keep asking them questions, so hopefully they'll stay on. So I just wanted to pick up a sort of general question from Richard Arthur, and apologies for the paraphrasing. But I just wondered if there was, for example, when we think about the Levant, and Ian's talked about this in other areas, you're talking a lot about water as an issue, and this is linked to climate change as a CO2 thing, and there's lots of ways of looking at that angle. But Richard's question is there a danger we focus only on one thing and then we lose the broader picture? And is there a danger in that, or is actually a useful way of focusing on the problem or on those broader problems? Ian, what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. There's various ways of answering it. I mean, you could argue that climate change itself is so broad and all-encompassing that tackling the climate change is as itself hugely interdisciplinary and then takes you into almost all of the kind of key issues. But at the end of the day, if you're also interested in human well-being, then it's about it's about jobs and health, and in that sense, sometimes climate change can seem quite far removed from people. I mean, I wonder if does seem to be a difference in the way people's perspectives, where at the the frontline places, and Jordan, I'm sure, with water is a frontline place, with where climate change is beginning to bite, have a different view of this than somewhere like Southwest England, where I am, and where it doesn't, climate change seems very remote to us. It's going to get a little bit wetter, it might be a bit stormier, but that's about it. So I think that in some areas, climate change manages to spread and to be this all-embracing aspect. But alongside that, I think, and this is touched on some of the questions, it becomes so huge and overwhelming that it almost freezes you. You almost get locked in and you think, well, what can we do? It's so big. So I think it's about trying to break it down into different components, for sure, because the totality is too huge. But I think all those threads lead back in some way into our fundamental relationship with the natural environment. And I think this assumption that one of the things that will change, I think, in the coming decade or so, will be a disenchantment with economic growth as the metric that we view well-being and success, and a much more nuanced set of things around well-being that will encourage businesses, governments, the whole sectors to start to reassess how they judge success and how we judge our relationship with the planet. And I think that's where we need to keep our focus, is that interface between humans and the environment that is our bit of the problem. But yeah, it's a really difficult, intractable problem.
So I might, before I ask Carol and Nizar if they want to come in on this as an issue, we've got another question that sort of picks up on some of that, I think, in the ideas of the fact that different places will respond in different ways, issues of scale and how things are perceived as well on the ground. So this question comes via Ash Parton from Kent at Saema in Oxford, and I'll just read this one out. So it says, in communicating scientific knowledge towards less advantaged regions, how can we avoid the issues of pushing our values and claiming the moral high ground? I understand that we have enough data, but what more can we provide, especially when exchanging knowledge towards the local citizens who do not have the luxury to care about global issues?
Yeah. So I work a lot in disaster seismic risk in Istanbul, and I have this thing where you go into these communities and you know these are communities that are going to be devastated by the next big earthquake in Istanbul. And so what I want to do is telling people about this, but I'm also hugely conscious that their everyday lives are really difficult. They're facing economic difficulties, social difficulties, you know, they're worried about health and wealth and all the rest of it. And here's me coming along saying, no, forget all of that. Here's another thing to worry about, because I'm interested in it from outside. And I think what that participatory approach of getting investigators to embed themselves more, expecting them to embed themselves more at the coalface in the communities, will only lead to better science. Now, it has costs because it takes time to do that, and it doesn't suit very well the modern academic system of research papers and metrics and all the rest of it. But I think it's the only authentic way to do it. And I think that then has to be us reflecting the matters, you know, this shift. Bruno Latour talks about the shift between matters of fact and matters of concern. The way I interpret it, it's a different way from him, but is communicators need to go away from just communicating what we know to actually listening and talking to people about what they're worried about, and then using our knowledge to help there. And until you've listened and talked to and listened to people, you don't know that. So it is a very live issue, I think, within the way that we use science and knowledge, which is very much in a top-down elitist way at the moment of imposing science on people, and that has to be addressed, really.
Carolyn or Nizar, do either of you want to come in on those kinds of points? Maybe not immediately. I guess Ian as well, that picks up on the idea of the co-creation of knowledge.
I just add that.
Sorry, I think we had a technical blip there. Nizar, please go ahead.
Yes, I think. Okay. Yes, I would just point out that you have to balance between raising concern and raising people's sense of hopelessness. And so this to overhammer this idea will kind of pushes people towards the idea, well, okay, there's nothing we can do about this. And so this is also a dangerous way to go. So I think there needs to be a balance between keeping people abreast about what we know and not pushing them to the point where they don't feel that any sacrifices they do or anything they might actually do at a personal level will make any difference. And so I would kind of keep that in mind as well. So, but that's so just keep people empowered. I think that's an important message as well.
Nizar, just on that, I absolutely agree with you. And it struck me when you were talking about Petra that in a way, maybe this is what, you know, this is really the motivation of the seminar, is that by showing that people like people here in the past have faced these big challenges and overcome them through ingenious, you know, technologies or ingenious cultural practices, that seems to me a positive thing, because you're absolutely right about driving people into fatalism. But in this sense, the past could be a way through, do you not think?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that.
From the perspective
I think,
of... Sorry. I guess part of the motivation of what I was speaking about is very much about valorizing traditional knowledge, valuing it, and I think, although farmers wouldn't necessarily see it or say it in that way, there's a huge amount of science of observation in these ways of living. And so in terms of, we have to be very, very careful about values or expectation and managing all of the things that have been said. But I suppose, communicating that there is a lot of knowledge, it has basis, and how can we engage with it in a humble way, in a modest way, is sort of a desire that's increasingly coming through, but it obviously a lot of care has to be taken, and there are many audiences, many individuals in here that to speak with, but it's opening the debate, opening the issues beyond academic papers and these things. And it's interesting and fascinating, I think, as well.
Carol, do you might not want to answer this, but do you actually think the universities are capable of doing this? So I would argue, I'm not entirely being just provocative here. I would argue that we need to do big action on climate change and emissions in the next decade, and if we don't make a big downturn there. So we need to really act fast. So in terms of, cultural history, that's fast on anyone's book, really. Do you think the academic world, just our world, not business and government, do you think our world is capable of switching modes in order to have action? Because that's what keeps me awake at night.
I share your concern. Partly the nature of academia makes us very sort of narrow or in our little fields, and we do need more broader viewpoints. I think academics, somehow we need to get people much more excited about the world we live in. If we can do that, then I think that's a huge achievement, whatever the discipline that you're studying or the engineering, just getting people excited about the world, the Levant region, it's amazing history. It makes me sad sometimes that people can think it's just problems. So can we get people excited about, Jordan covers, 4 climates, 4 vegetation zones. People for thousands of years have been dealing with these problems and in incredible, ingenious ways. And so I think just getting people inspired and trying, I think, and just being humble, I think about it is where I am right now. But yes, the problem with universities is the wonder of universities is you have these structures that are very embedded, but it's very hard to turn the ship. But I think communication is the way, and thinking about university being an education, or an education for life, not only for a job, if you like.
I think that point of inspiration ties into Nizar's point of not getting locked down in doom and gloom and fatalism as well. So I heartily agree with you on the inspiration side.
Okay, we've gone past our final our scheduled finish time, so I'm going to start to wrap things up now. I just wanted to thank, before I thank the speakers, really just thank you all for your questions and for your comments in the chat. There's a lot of great stuff in there, and I'm sorry that we've not been able to get to it all and discuss it all today. I think that bodes well for Ian's new role, and it bodes well for the work that CBRL continues to do in the region as well. And I think it gives us some focus and some ideas for where we might go next, which is great. I've been frantically writing notes for my next grant application, at least, which hopefully we can find a funder to do some transdisciplinary work with, which is another question that we didn't have time to discuss today. So I really just wanted to really thank Ian, Nizar and Carol again for their time today and for their interesting and stimulating presentations and this great discussion. Thank you all very much for coming. Please do check out the CBRL website for future events, and we hope to see you at one of these and maybe even in person before too long. Again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Attendees.